You have exactly 60 seconds to get this pile of medical waste off my dock before I have you arrested for visual pollution. The voice cut through the morning mist like a diamond cutter on glass, sharp, expensive, and completely devoid of empathy. It was 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the fog usually hugs the water like a soft blanket. But today, the silence was being murdered by Serafina Vane. She stood at the edge of the HOA's pristine, manicured pier, a woman who looked like she had been injection molded rather than born. She was wearing her signature light blue suit, the fabric so crisp it looked like it could draw blood if you brushed against it. And she was screaming at my father. My dad, Silas, sat in his wheelchair, his left hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the reel of his fishing rod. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't making noise. He was just sitting there, staring intently at the dark, glass-like surface of the water, watching for the subtle ripple of a specific type of invasive carp. To anyone else, he looked like a stroke survivor passing the time. To Serafina Vane, he was a stain on her property value. Behind her, 2 private security guards in tactical vests that were entirely too heavy for a suburban patrol were already reaching for my father's equipment. One of them kicked the plastic bucket Silas used to transport his specimens. It skittered across the wood and splashed into the water, sinking instantly. That was the moment the world shifted. I stepped out from the tree line, where I had been calibrating the flow sensors on the perimeter fence. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing oil-stained cargo pants and a faded flannel shirt, holding a heavy-duty hydraulic wrench that weighed about 15 pounds. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just walked onto the wood, the heavy thud of my work boots announcing my arrival. The guard reaching for my father's wheelchair froze. He looked at the wrench in my hand, then at my eyes, and decided that his hourly wage wasn't worth the physics equation he was about to solve. "Oh, look," Serafina sneered, adjusting her pearl necklace. "The gardener has arrived to collect the trash. Get him out of here. You are violating bylaw 49.2 regarding unsightly medical equipment in a recreational zone." I didn't look at her. I knelt beside my father, checking his pulse, making sure the stress hadn't spiked his blood pressure. He looked at me, his eyes clear and intelligent despite the drooping side of his face, and shook his head slightly. He was worried about the fish. He was worried about the water. He wasn't worried about himself. I stood up and turned to Serafina. "Mrs. Vane," I said, my voice low and steady, vibrating with the kind of calm that usually precedes a natural disaster. "You just kicked a specimen containment unit into the lake. You also threatened a disabled man who is performing a critical service for your community. I suggest you apologize, retrieve that bucket, and let him finish his work." Serafina laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound, like dry leaves skittering over concrete. "Work? He is a vagrant stealing fish from my lake. This is a private community amenity, Mr. Sterling. We own the water. We own the view. And right now, I own you. You have 5 minutes to disappear, or I call the sheriff and have you booked for trespassing." I looked at the massive, humming pump station visible just 50 yards down the shoreline. It was a $2 million piece of engineering, a nanopolymer filtration system designed to keep the artificial lake crystal clear for the residents of Serenity Falls Estates. I looked back at Serafina. "You own the pump, Serafina, but you don't understand the water. If you force us to leave, you are making a choice you cannot afford." "Try me," she hissed, pulling out her phone to dial 911. I checked my watch. 7:05 a.m. "Okay," I said. I turned to the security guards. Gentlemen, do not touch his chair again. I will move him. But mark the time. Mrs. Vane just fired her entire maintenance department. As I wheeled my father off the dock, the sound of Serafina's voice explaining to the dispatcher that there were aggressive transients on her property faded behind us. She thought she had won. She thought she had cleaned up her view. She had no idea that she had just pulled the pin on a biological grenade that was going to blow her entire empire to pieces in exactly 48 hours. To understand why Serafina Vane was about to lose everything, you have to understand who I am, and more importantly, what this land actually is. To the residents of Serenity Falls, I was Thorne Sterling, the scruffy, unkempt son of the old man who lived in the dilapidated farmhouse on the ridge. They thought I was an unemployed drifter who had inherited a burden. They saw my rusted pickup truck and my muddy boots and assumed I was barely scraping by. They were wrong. 48 hours before the incident on the dock, I was sitting in the hayloft of our main barn, but I wasn't baling hay. I was sitting in front of a portable military-grade server rack, analyzing geological density scans of the aquifer that ran beneath our feet. I am not a gardener. I am a hydrological engineer with a specialization in critical infrastructure security. For the last 15 years, I have worked for the Army Corps of Engineers and private contractors, designing fail-safes for dams and water tables in conflict zones. I don't just understand water. I understand how it moves, how it breathes, and how it can be weaponized if you don't respect it. When my father had his stroke 6 months ago, I took an indefinite leave of absence to come home. I didn't come back just to take care of him. I came back to activate the Sterling Water Pact. My great-grandfather didn't just buy 800 acres of scrubland in the 1890s. He signed a federal land patent that designated our property as a primary bio-buffer zone. We sit on top of the headwaters that feed the entire valley. The creek that flows through our land isn't just water. It is the lifeblood of the local ecosystem. And 20 years ago, when the Serenity Falls HOA was built, they illegally diverted that creek to fill their artificial lake. They built a dam. They built a massive filtration plant. And they started selling waterfront living to millionaires. My father, Silas, was a professor of limnology, the study of inland waters. He knew they were stealing the water, but he didn't fight them with lawyers. He knew something they didn't. The water in this region is rich in a specific nutrient that attracts the Myxobolus carp, a highly invasive species. These fish are ugly. They are bottom feeders, but they have one unique biological trait. They consume the microscopic slime algae that thrives in stagnant water. The HOA's fancy $2 million nanopolymer filter is a miracle of technology, but it has an Achilles heel. It cannot handle organic slime. If the algae blooms, it coats the nanofibers in a cement-like paste. The pumps overheat, the seals blow, and the system destroys itself. For 20 years, my father had been getting up at 4 a.m., going down to the water, and manually removing the invasive carp that were getting too big, while leaving the younger ones to eat the algae. It was a delicate, daily biological balancing act. He was the only reason their water was clear. He was the only reason their pumps hadn't melted down. He was doing it for free, because he loved the water, even if he hated the people who claimed to own it. And Serafina Vane had just kicked him out. I loaded my father's wheelchair into the back of the truck. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from frustration. He looked at me, his speech slurred but his mind sharp. "Thorne," he stammered, "the balance. The slime. It comes fast." "I know, Dad," I said, securing the straps. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. It roared to life, a stark contrast to the quiet electric hum of the golf carts the HOA residents used. I looked back at the lake. It was beautiful, shimmering in the morning light. It was a lie. Without my father, that lake was a ticking time bomb. We drove up the ridge to our farmhouse. From the porch, you could see the entire layout of the valley. You could see the sprawling mansions of Serenity Falls, their emerald green lawns, their infinity pools, all fed by the water they siphoned from our creek. I helped my father inside, settled him into his favorite chair by the window, and went to my office. I pulled up the schematics of the HOA's pump station on my laptop. It was a public record, filed with the county when they applied for the permit. I zoomed in on the specifications for the filtration unit. Model X9000 Nanomatrix. Tolerance: 0.5% organic viscosity. I did the math. Without the carp population being managed, the slime production in the lake would double every 6 hours. The viscosity would hit critical mass in 48 hours. Once the slime hit the filters, the back pressure would spike. If they didn't shut it down immediately, the friction would fuse the ceramic seals. I sat back. This was it. They wanted a war. They were about to get a lesson in biology. But I had to be smart. I couldn't just let it happen without a paper trail. I needed them to do this to themselves. I needed Serafina Vane to sign her own death warrant. I spent the next hour drafting a document. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a notice of compliance. I wrote it in plain English, stripping away the legal jargon, making it sound like a surrender. I, Thorne Sterling, acting as guardian for Silas Sterling, acknowledge the HOA's demand to cease all biological interaction with the lake. We agree to remove all equipment and cease all maintenance activities effective immediately. I printed it out. I drove down to the HOA office. It was a building that looked more like a palace than an administrative center, with marble floors and a fountain in the lobby. Serafina was sitting behind a desk that cost more than my truck, typing furiously on her phone. When she saw me, she didn't even look up. "I thought I told you to leave?" she said. "I'm just here to make it official," I said, sliding the paper across the polished mahogany. "You wanted us gone. We're gone. This is just confirmation that we are complying with your orders. No more fishing, no more buckets, no more unsightly medical equipment." She picked up the paper, scanning it with a sneer. She pulled a gold pen from a holder and scribbled her signature at the bottom with a flourish. "Finally," she said, tossing the paper back at me. "Some people just need to be told their place. Now get out." I took the paper. I folded it carefully and placed it in my breast pocket. "Just so we are clear, Serafina," I said, pausing at the door. "By signing this, you are accepting full responsibility for the ecosystem management of the reservoir." She laughed again. "Ecosystem? It's a pool, you idiot. We have chlorinated tablets for that." I walked out. Holy cow, she really had no idea. Chlorine doesn't kill the slime produced by Myxobolus carp. It actually feeds it. She was about to accelerate the process. I drove back to the farm and texted my old contact, Kale, a structural engineer I'd worked with in Dubai. "Phase 1 is active," I wrote. "The failsafe has been pulled. Monitor the pressure readings." Kale texted back a single emoji, a popcorn bucket. The first 24 hours were quiet. Too quiet. From my vantage point on the ridge, the lake looked peaceful. The residents were out on their paddleboards. I saw Serafina walking along the shoreline with a group of potential investors, pointing at the water, probably bragging about how she had cleaned up the neighborhood. She had no idea that beneath the surface, a biological uprising was beginning. My father sat by the window watching. "Is it starting?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, handing him a cup of tea. But nature doesn't rush. By the afternoon of the second day, the signs began to appear. Subtle at first. I was monitoring the remote sensors I had buried along the property line years ago. The flow rate at the intake valve was dropping. Not because the water was low, but because the water was getting thicker. The slime was binding with the water molecules, creating a transparent, viscous gel that was invisible to the naked eye, but deadly to high-precision machinery. Down in the subdivision, the first complaints started hitting the HOA group chat. I had hacked into their network weeks ago, a simple brute force entry into their unsecured Wi-Fi, so I could see everything. Karen from Lot 4B. "Why is the water pressure in my shower so low?" Mike from Lot 12. "My infinity pool isn't cycling. The water looks oily." Serafina's response was immediate and dismissive. "The system is undergoing routine calibration. We are increasing the pump pressure to compensate. Please be patient." I watched the readout on my screen. Pump pressure, 105%. She was forcing the system. She was pushing the engine into the red zone. By evening, the smell started. It wasn't a sewage smell. It was something more ancient. A musky, sweet, rotting scent of algae blooming out of control. The carp, unchecked by my father's culling, were gorging themselves on the algae, excreting the enzyme at a rate that was turning the lake into a giant petri dish. I drove down to the perimeter fence that evening. I stood there, watching the pump station. I could hear it from here, a high-pitched whine like a jet engine trying to take off with the brakes on. The cooling fans were screaming. A golf cart rolled up to the fence on the other side. It was Serafina again, accompanied by the sheriff, a man named Miller who had been elected largely due to HOA campaign donations. "You, Serafina," pointed a finger at me through the chain-link fence. "What did you do?" I stood my ground, leaning against a fence post. "I did exactly what you asked, Mrs. Vane. I stopped my father from fishing." "Don't play games with me!" she shrieked. Her composure was cracking. The hairspray was failing. "The smell is awful. The pumps are acting up. You poisoned the water." "Sheriff," I said, nodding to the officer, "I haven't stepped foot on HOA property since yesterday morning. I have been on my land all day. You can check my cameras." Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable. He sniffed the air. "It does smell pretty bad, Mrs. Vane." "Maybe a pipe burst?" "It's sabotage," she insisted. "He's jealous. He's a bitter, poor little man who can't stand that we have a paradise and he has a dirt farm." I looked at the pump station. The whine was changing pitch. It was developing a rhythmic thumping sound. Thump whine, thump whine. That was the sound of a cavitation bubble forming in the impeller housing. The slime had clogged the intake mesh so thoroughly that the pump was trying to suck a vacuum. "Mrs. Vane," I said, checking my watch. It was 7 p.m. "I highly suggest you shut that system down, right now. Right. If you don't, the friction is going to melt the seals." She glared at me, her eyes filled with hate. "I don't take orders from you. I ordered the technician to increase pressure to 120%. We are flushing your poison out." She didn't realize that arrogance is expensive, and watching a tyrant receive the bill for their own stupidity is absolutely priceless. I stepped back from the fence. "Okay," I said. "I warned you." I turned and walked back to my truck. I didn't want to be too close when it happened. I drove back up the ridge to the farmhouse. My dad was waiting on the porch. "Did she listen?" he asked. "No," I said. "She turned it up." We sat there in the twilight, watching the lights of the subdivision twinkle below. It looked idyllic. It looked perfect. And then, at exactly 8:14 p.m., the lights went out. Not the house lights, the floodlights on the pump station. A sound rolled up the valley, deep and resonant, like a thunderclap trapped in a box. Boom. Then came the smoke. Thick, black smoke billowing out of the ventilation shafts of the pump house. The high-pitched whine died instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. The heart of Serenity Falls had just stopped beating. Down below, the chaos began. I could see flashlights running towards the lake. I checked the sensor data on my laptop. Flow rate, 0. Pump temperature, critical. System status, catastrophic failure. They had burned it out. The slime had sealed the filters shut, and Serafina had rammed enough electricity through the motors to fuse the entire mechanism into a solid block of useless metal. The next morning, the sun rose over a disaster. The lake wasn't empty yet, but it was dying. Without the circulation from the massive pumps, the water was stagnant. The surface was covered in a thick, frothy scum. The smell was unbearable, reaching all the way up to our porch. I was drinking coffee when the convoy arrived. Not just Serafina and the sheriff this time. It was a mob. About 50 residents, angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. They gathered at my gate, shouting, waving fists. Serafina was at the front, holding a megaphone. "He did this!" she screamed, pointing at my house. "He sabotaged the intake. He wants to destroy our property values. Arrest him!" Sheriff Miller was pounding on my gate. "Mr. Sterling, come out! We need to talk!" I put down my coffee. I looked at my dad. "Stay here," I said. I walked down the driveway. I didn't bring the wrench this time. I brought a tablet. I walked right up to the gate. The mob quieted down slightly, waiting for the violence, waiting for the resistance. "Open this gate!" Serafina screamed. "You are under arrest for eco-terrorism!" "This is nonsense," I said calmly. "I haven't touched your system." "Liar!" a man in a polo shirt yelled. "Our water is off. The taps are dry. The lake smells like a sewer." "That's because your system choked," I said. I tapped the screen of my tablet and held it up. It showed a real-time diagram of the water chemistry. "See this spike? That's biological viscosity. Your filter couldn't handle the slime." "What slime?" Serafina demanded. "The water was crystal clear until you showed up." "The water was clear because my father cleared it," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry over the crowd. For 20 years, Silas Sterling removed the Myxobolus carp that produced that slime. He did it every morning. He did it for free. He did it because he knew your fancy $2 million system has a fatal flaw. It can't handle organics. The crowd went silent. They looked at Serafina. She looked pale. That's a lie," she stammered. "He was just an old man fishing." "He was the biofilter," I said ruthlessly. "He was the only thing keeping your system alive. You kicked him out. You banned him. You called him trash. And then, when the pressure rose, instead of investigating, you ramped up the power. You forced the system to swallow a brick. You burned out your own pumps, Serafina. You didn't just break the machine. You destroyed the balance. No, she whispered. And now, I continued, looking at the angry residents, you have no water. Your lake is turning into a swamp. And the replacement parts for a custom nanomatrix system have a lead time of 6 months. Oh, and the cost? I checked the manufacturer's website this morning. $3 million, plus installation. The crowd turned toward Serafina. The anger that had been directed at me shifted like the wind. Is this true? The man in the polo shirt asked Serafina. Did you ban him from fishing? He was unsightly, she shrieked, defensive now. He didn't fit the image. The image? A woman yelled. My house is worth $1.5 million and I can't flush my toilet. Serafina looked trapped. She looked desperate. And desperate people do dangerous things. She glared at me, her eyes wild. This is your land, she screamed at me. The creek comes from your land. You have to fix it. I am declaring a state of emergency. By the power of the HOA charter, I am authorizing the seizure of the upstream flow. She turned to the security guards. Cut the fence. Get the excavators. We are taking the water directly from the source. She was pointing at the heavy-duty chain-link fence that separated my property from theirs. She was ordering them to invade. Sheriff Miller looked alarmed. Mrs. Vane, you can't just— Do it, she screamed, or I will have your badge. I own this town. The security guards hesitated, then moved toward the fence with bolt cutters. The heavy diesel roar of an excavator started up behind the crowd. They were actually going to do it. They were going to breach my perimeter. I didn't move to stop them. I didn't fight. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out a satellite phone. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 3 years. Stop, I said, but not to them. I was speaking to the crowd. If you cross that fence line, you aren't just trespassing. You are committing a federal felony. Serafina laughed, manic and high-pitched. Federal? You're a dirt farmer. Cut it! The guard snapped the bolt cutters. The chain link fell open. The excavator rolled forward, its tracks tearing up the earth, crossing the property line. I spoke into the phone. This is Commander Thorne Sterling, clearance code Alpha 9 Zulu. I have a confirmed breach of a federal Class 1 watershed protection zone. Hostiles are using heavy machinery, requesting immediate intervention. I hung up. Serafina stared at me. Commander? You didn't check the deed, Serafina, I said softly. This isn't just a farm. This is a strategic national water reserve. And you just invaded federal land. The sound of rotors chopped the air in the distance. The wind began to pick up. The cavalry wasn't coming. It was already here. The excavator blade bit into the soil of my property with a sound like tearing metal, a heavy groaning crunch that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Clumps of protected wetland soil that hadn't been disturbed since the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, flew into the air. Serafina Vane stood there, her face flushed with the manic high of someone who believes they have finally crushed their enemy. She was pointing, shouting orders over the roar of the diesel engine, directing the operator to dig a trench straight toward the natural spring head that fed the creek. Take it all, she screamed, her voice cracking. Dig it deep! We'll drain him dry! Sheriff Miller was shouting now, trying to wave the operator down, but the noise was deafening. The crowd of residents had surged forward, a mix of curiosity and desperation pushing them toward the fence line. They wanted water. They didn't care where it came from. Mob mentality had taken over, fueled by fear and the lies Serafina had been feeding them for years. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I stood perfectly still, watching the excavator tear another gouge into the earth. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with the slow, heavy rhythm of a countdown clock hitting 0. Serafina turned to me, her eyes wild. "You see?" she shrieked over the engine noise. "You can't stop progress. You can't stop us. We are the community. We have the right." "You have the right to remain silent," I said, though she couldn't hear me over the machinery. "But I doubt you have the capacity." Then the wind changed. It wasn't a breeze, it was a pressure wave, a rhythmic thumping beat that started in your chest and moved outward. Thwump, thwump, thwump. The trees along the ridge began to whip violently. The surface of the stagnant, slimy lake rippled in concentric circles, not from fish, but from sound pressure. The excavator operator felt it first. He stopped the bucket mid-swing, looking up through the skylight of his cab. The roar of the diesel engine was suddenly swallowed by a much larger, much louder mechanical scream. 2 black helicopters tore over the tree line, flying low and fast, their noses dipped in an aggressive intercept posture. These weren't traffic choppers. They were heavy-lift utility aircraft with government markings, the kind used for rapid deployment in disaster zones. The downdraft hit the crowd like a physical blow, flattening the grass and sending Serafina's perfectly coiffed hair into a chaotic frenzy. Dust billowed up, blinding the security guards. The excavator operator killed the engine and threw his hands up, terrified. "What is this?" Serafina screamed, shielding her eyes against the grit. "Who did you call?" I didn't answer. I just watched as the lead chopper hovered over the breached fence line, a loudhailer cutting through the noise. "Shut down the equipment. Step away from the vehicle. This is a federal intervention. All personnel on the ground don't. Do not move." Simultaneously, the main gate to the HOA, visible in the distance, was breached. Not by a delivery truck, but by a convoy of 4 black SUVs with flashing red and blue lights. No sirens, just lights. They moved with precision, speeding down the main boulevard, ignoring the speed bumps, heading straight for us. The crowd scrambled back, the anger draining out of them, replaced by the primal fear of authority they didn't understand. Sheriff Miller looked at the SUVs, saw the government plates, and holstered his weapon immediately. He knew. He knew this was way above his pay grade. The SUVs skidded to a halt on the gravel access road. Doors flew open. A dozen agents in windbreakers swarmed out. They weren't the FBI. They were armed officers from the Department of the Interior's Law Enforcement Division and the Army Corps of Engineers' Critical Infrastructure Team. Serafina stumbled back, bumping into one of her security guards. "This is private property," she yelled, though her voice was trembling now. "You have no jurisdiction here. I am the president of the association." A tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a field general stepped out of the lead SUV. He ignored Serafina completely. He walked straight past the sheriff, straight past the trembling excavator operator, and walked up to me. He looked at my muddy boots, my flannel shirt, and then he looked me in the eye and snapped a sharp, crisp salute. "Commander Sterling," he said, his voice carrying over the dying wind of the rotors. "We received your Code Alpha distress. Status of the breach?" "Active breach of the Class 1 containment zone, Director," I said, returning the salute. "Heavy machinery used to alter a federally protected waterway. Potential contamination of the regional aquifer." Serafina let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Commander, he's a gardener. He fixes tractors." The director turned slowly to look at her. His gaze was like a physical weight. "Ma'am, The man you are screaming at is Commander Thorne Sterling, Senior Strategic Advisor for the National Water Security Bureau. You just ordered a bulldozer onto a site that protects the drinking water for 3 counties. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. It was heavier than the noise had been. Residents looked from me to Serafina, then back to me. The pieces were clicking into place. The sensors, the technical language. The garden looked more like a laboratory. That's impossible, Serafina whispered. His father, I interrupted, stepping forward, is Professor Silas Sterling, the man who wrote the foundational text on biotic filtration systems that your engineers used to design your pumps. The man you just called unsightly trash. Serafina's face went pale, the blood draining away until she looked like a wax figure melting in the sun. Secure the operator, the director ordered his team. Impound the machinery. I want environmental impact assessments to start immediately, and get that fence line secured. 2 agents moved toward the excavator operator, who was practically climbing out of the cab to surrender. Another pair moved toward Serafina. Wait! Serafina shouted, backing away, her heels sinking into the mud she had created. I was protecting the community. We have no water. He cut it off. He's the criminal here. I didn't cut anything off, Serafina, I said, walking toward her. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I told you. I warned you. You killed the system yourself. Liar, she screeched. The pumps burned out because you sabotaged the intake. The pumps burned out, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the terrified residents. Because you fired the cleaning crew. I turned to the crowd. I needed them to understand. I needed them to feel the weight of what they had allowed to happen. Who here knows how a nanopolymer filter works? Silence. It works by pushing water through microscopic pores, I explained. It traps everything, dirt, bacteria, algae. But there is one thing it cannot handle, organic slime. The kind of slime produced by Myxobolus carp when they overpopulate. I pointed to the stagnant green-brown sludge that was once their pristine lake. That slime is what killed your pumps. For 20 years, my father spent every morning removing those fish. He kept the population low. He kept the slime levels at 0. He was a living, breathing biological control unit. I looked at the man in the polo shirt who had yelled at me earlier. He saved you $50,000 a year in industrial cleaning fees. He did it for free. And because Mrs. Vane thought a wheelchair looked ugly on her dock, she banned him. In 48 hours, the slime levels spiked by 400%. The filters are clogged. The pumps tried to push sludge through a pinhole. They overheated and died. The realization hit the crowd like a physical wave. I saw it in their eyes. The horror, the regret, the calculation of how much this was going to cost them. You mean? A woman in the front row whispered, her hand covering her mouth. The old man, he was keeping the water clean? He was the only thing keeping it clean, I confirmed. You didn't have a magic filter. You had a dedicated expert working in the shadows, and you spat on him. Serafina was shaking her head frantically. No, that's not true. It's tech. It's expensive tech. We don't need fish. You need nature, I said coldly, and you tried to pave over it. The director stepped up beside me. Mrs. Vane, you are under arrest for violation of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, sabotage of critical infrastructure, and unauthorized excavation on federal land. You can't arrest me, she shrieked as the agents took her arms. I am the president. I have a gala next week. Do you know who my husband is? I don't care. the director said, snapping the handcuffs onto her wrists. "But I suspect he's going to need a very good lawyer." As they marched her toward the SUV, her light blue suit was splattered with the dark, oily mud from the excavator's tracks. She looked small. She looked defeated. But she still looked hateful. She twisted her head back to look at me one last time. "You ruined it!" she screamed. "Oh, you ruined paradise!" "It wasn't paradise, Serafina," I called back. "It was a parasite, and the host just shook you off." At that moment, she finally understood that true power isn't about shouting orders or wearing expensive suits. It's about understanding how the world actually works beneath the surface. The doors of the SUV slammed shut, cutting off her screams. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the cooling tick of the excavator engine and the distant murmur of the stunned crowd. But the problem wasn't solved yet. Serafina was gone, but the water was still off. The lake was still a swamp, and 500 people were looking at me with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. He looked diminished, a man who realized he had backed the wrong horse for years. "Commander, Mr. Sterling, what do we do? People have no water." I looked at the director. He nodded. "It's your call, Commander. It's your land." I looked at the residents. They weren't the enemy. They were sheep who had been led by a wolf. They had kids. They had elderly parents. They were thirsty. "We can't fix the pumps," I said, addressing the crowd. "That machinery is slag. It will take months to replace." A collective groan went through the group. "However," I continued, raising my voice, "there is a gravity feed bypass valve on the original 1920s infrastructure. It connects the upper creek to your distribution main. It was capped off when you built the fancy electric system." "Can you open it?" the man in the polo shirt asked, hope flaring in his eyes. "I can," I said. "But the water won't be filtered by a nanomatrix. It will be natural creek water. It will be clean, safe, but it won't be crystal clear. It might have a little silt in it after a rainstorm. It's real water." "We don't care," a woman shouted. "We just want to flush our toilets." "There's a condition," I said. The crowd tensed. "The bypass is on Sterling Trust land. If I open it, you are acknowledging that the water belongs to the trust. You will pay a usage fee, not to me, to the Silas Sterling Conservation Fund. The money will be used to restore the wetlands you damaged and to fund an educational program on watershed management." "How much?" someone asked warily. "Market rate," I said, "plus 10% for the stupidity tax of letting your HOA president declare war on physics." A few people chuckled nervously. It broke the tension. "Deal," the man in the polo shirt said. "Where do we sign?" "You don't sign," I said. "You vote. Dissolve the HOA board immediately. Appoint an interim council that answers to the trust regarding water usage, and apologize to my father." I turned and pointed up the hill. My dad was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching everything through a pair of binoculars. He raised a hand and waved. The crowd turned, hesitantly at first. Then with more enthusiasm, they waved back. It wasn't a cheer, but it was an acknowledgement. A truce. "Director," I said, "let's get the engineers to the bypass valve. We have a neighborhood to hydrate." The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. The Army Corps' engineers worked with Kyle and me to excavate the old iron valve box. It was buried under 3 feet of decorative landscaping bark that Serafina had installed. When we finally exposed the wheel, it was rusted shut. "We need a torch," an engineer said. "No," I said. "We need leverage." I grabbed the heavy hydraulic wrench from my truck, the same one I had carried onto the dock. I fitted it to the nut. I braced my feet against the earth. "Cale, give me a hand." Together we pushed. The metal groaned. It shrieked. And then, with a sound like a gunshot, the rust broke. The valve turned. Deep underground, water rushed into the pipes. A vibration ran through the ground, a hum of life returning to the dead infrastructure. Down in the valley, a cheer went up. I saw a sprinkler sputter to life in someone's front yard, spitting brown water for a second before running clear. We had water. But the cleanup was just beginning. The lake itself was still a disaster. It took 3 weeks for the biological balance to restore. With Serafina in federal custody awaiting trial, the interim council gave me full authority over the lake management. I brought my father down the next morning. The water was still murky, the smell still lingering, but the flow was back. "It's a mess," Silas said, looking at the scum on the surface. "It is," I agreed, "but it's our mess now." "We need the fish," he said. "The population exploded. They're starving now because the algae is dying off." "I know," I said. "I have a team coming to do a controlled catch and release to the lower wetlands, but we need a supervisor." I looked at him. "You up for it?" He smiled, the drooping side of his face crinkling. "Get my bucket." The legal fallout for Serafina was catastrophic. The forensic audit conducted by Mercer revealed that she hadn't just embezzled the maintenance fund. She had taken out loans in the HOA's name to fund her lifestyle, using the waterfront view as collateral. When the view turned into a mud pit, the banks called the loans. The residents of Serenity Falls were hit with a special assessment fee that made their eyes water. $15,000 per household to cover the debts and the fines levied by the EPA for the environmental damage. But strangely, most of them didn't blame me. They blamed the woman who had lied to them. They realized that the cheap route, ignoring the grumpy old man, trusting the lady in the nice suit, had cost them everything. 6 months later, the neighborhood looked different. The pristine, chemical blue look of the lake was gone. It was darker now, a more natural green-blue. Reeds had been planted along the edges to help with natural filtration. The no trespassing signs were gone, replaced by signs that read, "Protected Habitat, managed by Sterling Trust." I was walking the perimeter one Saturday morning when I saw a group of kids standing on the dock, the same dock where Serafina had screamed at us. They were holding fishing rods. My dad was there, in his wheelchair. He wasn't fishing. He was pointing at the water, explaining something to the kids. I walked closer. "You see that shadow?" Silas was saying, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "That's a pike. He's the predator. He keeps the smaller fish moving. If you take him out, the little ones eat all the bugs, and the bugs stop eating the algae, and the water gets sick. Everything has a job." "Even the ugly fish?" a little girl asked. "Especially the ugly fish," Silas said. "They do the dirty work so the water stays clear." The man in the polo shirt, his name was Dave, I had learned, was standing nearby watching his son cast a line. He saw me and walked over. "Morning, Commander," he said. The nickname had stuck. "Morning, Dave. How's the pressure?" "Better than ever," he said. "And the bill is half what it used to be." He paused, looking at the group on the dock. "You know, Serafina's trial starts next week." "I heard," I said. "I'm testifying." "Good," Dave said. "We all filed victim impact statements. She tried to sell her house to pay for her defense, but nobody would buy it. It's in foreclosure." I looked up the hill at the massive mansion that overlooked the lake. It sat empty now, the windows dark, the lawn starting to brown at the edges because nobody was watering it. It looked like a tombstone for an ego. "It's a nice house," what I said. "Structurally sound." Dave looked at me. "Are you thinking of buying it?" I laughed. "No, I like my farm, but I was thinking it would make a great community center, a place to teach people about what actually keeps their property values up." "Science?" Dave asked. "Respect," I said, "and maybe a little bit of biology." The sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the mist. The lake sparkled, not with the fake gloss of chemicals, but with the deep, living shine of a healthy ecosystem. I watched my dad laugh as the little girl reeled in a sunfish. He helped her unhook it, showed her how to hold it so she didn't hurt the scales, and watched her release it back into the water. It wasn't just a lake anymore. It was a lesson. Serafina Vane had wanted a view. She wanted a picture-perfect backdrop for her life. She didn't understand that a view is just a surface. Real beauty, lasting beauty, has to work. It has to breathe. It has to get its hands dirty. She tried to ban the one thing that made her world possible because it didn't fit her aesthetic. She learned the hard way that you can't curate nature. You can't issue a citation to a biological process. And you definitely shouldn't pick a fight with a man who holds the keys to the faucet. I walked out onto the dock. My dad looked up and smiled. "Hey," he said, "the water looks good today." "Yeah," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "It's clear." "Caught 3 of the big ones," he said, gesturing to his bucket. "Slime levels should be down by evening." "Good work," I said. "The pumps are purring." "They better be," he said, casting his line again. "I'm not fixing them again." I looked out at the water, flowing from my land, through the community, and down into the valley. It connected us all, whether we liked it or not. We share the resource. We share the responsibility. And if you forget that, if you think you're above the flow, eventually the water reminds you, sometimes with a flood, sometimes with a drought, and sometimes with a cloud of slime that eats your $1,000,000 empire from the inside out. As I walked back to my truck, I checked my phone. A notification from the bank. The first payment from the Silas Sterling Conservation Fund had cleared. It was enough to retrofit the barn, upgrade the sensors, and maybe, just maybe, buy a new boat. A proper research vessel. I smiled. The gardener and the vagrant had done okay. We defended the land. We protected the water. And we taught a neighborhood that the most valuable thing isn't the view from your window. It's the integrity of what lies beneath. If you enjoyed watching nature and justice serve a cold slice of humble pie, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us bring you more stories like this. Thanks for listening.
Just sharing some good energy today. Like the video and subscribe to read stories.